Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the ayfie webinar, Automating the Identification of Personal Data for Discovery and Data Breach Investigations. I'm Heather Murphy, Senior Director of Inbound Marketing. Today we have Paul Getman, the Director of Product Management here at ayfie. Good morning, Paul.
Hello, good morning.
Welcome, everybody. Please let us know if you have any problems with audio. If you're unable to hear us, you always have the option to dial in. We have a little poll up here. If you can hear us, please click on the yes. If no, click on the no. We'll give you a few seconds to answer that poll.
It's definitely the easiest poll.
Yeah, it's the easiest poll you'll have today. Take advantage of that. All righty. So Paul, how about if we get started here?
Sounds good.
We'll do a little kind of housekeeping, so to speak. If you want to pop open. We're going to be recording this webinar today so that in the upcoming 1 or 2 days we'll be able to send out the full recording as well as the slides. So if you have any questions throughout any of the webinar, feel free to use the chat button down at the bottom of the Zoom bar. And we will be doing a question and answer at the end of the webinar. So if you could hold your questions till then, I will be taking notes and we will do all the question and answers at the end. So Paul, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Heather.
No problem.
We're gonna go through several sections, but we're gonna do it fairly rapidly. This will only go about 25 minutes, and then we'll leave room, like Heather said, for Q&A at the end. So the sections we're working with today are: when do investigations, like internal investigations and e-discovery type reviews, when do they require personal data identification? Then we'll look at GDPR as an umbrella set of PII, PHI, and PCI. So it's really sort of a macro set of identifications that we're commonly used to doing already here in the United States during discovery and investigations. We'll also take a look at how ayfie identifies GDPR content. So kind of a look under the hood at how we use natural language processing and analytics to do that. And we'll take a quick view of what the dashboards look like that we help clients with on the front end, the user front end for enterprise compliance, investigation, and discovery. And then we'll save at least 5, maybe 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So I started out as a database administrator in this world of discovery years ago, and I was doing processing, and of course we had to take care of a lot of PII back then, and I always wanted some sort of automated tool to do this because we were at first using keywords and then using regular expression libraries, and that was cumbersome to manage and maintain all of those regex libraries. So it's been fun to help clients here do this in a more automated way, which is a little bit more secure and easier, certainly. So I was often glad that I wasn't one of those custodians in Enron. If you guys remember back during about 2004 to about 2014, there was almost a decade there when the Enron data set became available. And this was a great thing for demos, but I mean, that was rough to be one of those custodians because we were demoing their PII and personal emails back then. It just sort of, it's an example of how far we've come and just sort of our awareness. Now we've cleaned up that data set. We don't demo the versions of it with PII anymore in it. And I attribute some of this awareness to several things, really. So we've had a lot of things happen. We've had all these data breaches across, the world, really, but especially here in the United States, we've had a lot in the press. And we've passed associated laws across all 50 states. We've also become aware of the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, going into effect, and the California Consumer Privacy Act. But even before those things came into effect, we already had in the US things like Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, and the Personal Credit Information Regulation. So we were already working with some of these regulations prior to that. Now, some of the use cases that we are hearing the most about from our clients are sort of roughly in rank order. We're working with several clients right now on preparing for data breach investigation responses for regulators and for individuals. And this is a new type of thing that the general counsel or e-discovery teams, managed services providers are starting to help their enterprise clients with. So as the chief information security officer or CIO is handling a data breach, they reach out to general counsel and they end up conducting, very much an e-discovery type review. But the first pass review in this type of a review is identifying all the PII and PHI that's been breached. That then determines whether or not you have to notify regulators or notify the individual data subjects that whose data was breached. So it becomes very much an e-discovery process, and PII is central to that first level review. We're also just helping clients with sort of run-of-the-mill discovery. So from collection and identification through review, but you definitely have to, redact certain privilege and PII type information prior to production. So if you have the ability to automate the identification of that, early upstream at the identification collection phase or later in review, it makes everyone's lives on that team a lot easier, and it's a lot less error prone if you have an automated way of tagging that to begin with. So another use case is FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and there, government agencies from state and federal, they're doing very much an e-discovery review. They're under a mandate to produce data from their organization, but they first have to make sure it's cleansed of PII and other personal data. So an automated tool for identifying all these categories also helps them. And then lastly, we're working with several enterprise clients with our GDPR compliance tool, mostly in Europe, but this has given us a lot of experience in figuring out what types of steps and stages you go through in compliance, or to reach compliance, as you demonstrate compliance and show that your organization can meet this regulation. So we sort of warned you guys ahead of time that there might be a couple polls. There's only two, but this is the first audience poll. So if you guys have the ability and want to weigh in on this topic, if you take a guess as to, in August 2018, how many affected companies were still not compliant with the EU's GDPR? And I'll just give it maybe 10, 20 seconds for some participants to weigh in. Okay, we probably gave people just enough time. All right, so let me drag the poll results over. I think I can do that. So the poll results came out this way. We've got about 50%, 75% of the participants said 50%. And that's actually what I would have thought as well. The answer is actually 33%, about a third. And this is, it's just one poll. This is a poll from a recent Forbes article. And I think what they're doing, they're measuring this globally, but it was surprisingly low to me as well. When I was first looking into the compliance rates, or how much companies were actually prepared as of May when GDPR went into effect, the polls back then were showing more like 85% of affected organizations were not ready for GDPR at that phase. So either they've played a lot of catch up, or the polling has changed a little bit, but 50% makes sense to me, but according to them, it was actually a third. So at that point, and still what we're hearing is that compliance rates are lowest in finance and the healthcare industries, and only 47% of affected law firms were fully prepared at the date that GDPR went into effect. So it's, I guess in a lot of ways, it's not surprising. A lot of these types of very large, complex compliance rules that go into effect take a while for industries as a whole to adopt. So there's kind of a long tail, and there'll be a lot of ongoing work to be done. So there's two main reasons we've been finding that it's important for the US side legal discovery teams to stay on top of GDPR. Of course, in Europe, this is very much what they're doing at the enterprise level and for discovery purposes. But in the US, it's still important for a couple reasons. GDPR often does apply in cases of US data breach and e-discovery workflows because you often have European data from data subjects in the collection. So you're automatically, working under those rules as well as the US regulation. So the other major reason we've been talking to clients a lot about it is that GDPR is an umbrella or macro set of PII and PCI identifications. So if you are doing GDPR categories as a set of identifications in your enterprise or in discovery processes, you're catching most everything else that you do need to satisfy regular PCI and PII type categories as well. So it's a good place to start. It applies to all companies selling to and storing personal information about European data subjects. So it really is a big policy change globally. And if you think about it, one of the articles I was reading talked about how simple it is to find yourself in the midst of GDPR. If you have a public-facing website anywhere globally, and you're allowing folks to sign in and leave their email addresses or phone numbers, or you're collecting personal data, and some of those people might be European data subjects, and these days they might be California data subjects. So you're opening up the doors to IP addresses, MAC addresses, email addresses, and several types of personal data. So that becomes one of the simplest ways to actually stumble into GDPR compliance regulations without actually doing business necessarily in the EU. So it affects all the existing data retention and compliance privacy laws that we currently have. So that's something that companies work with their general counsel on. When does HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley apply? PCI, when do those apply? And when does GDPR apply? And when is there a legitimate business purpose to keep those records around? So creating rules around that is something companies are working internally with their general counsel on generally. So another aspect of GDPR is that all processes handling personal data must be built with data protection by design and by default. So you guys have probably received these emails as well, where marketing groups are saying, hey, do you want to stay in touch? Click yes to opt in, and we've been doing that as well. And it even comes down to building software. How do you make sure that if there's personal data being stored in tables and databases, are you encrypting it? Are you walling it off in a safe and secure fashion? So that touches a lot of different areas. Now, one of the reasons it's got a lot of publicity, of course, is the potential cost of non-compliance. It can be very steep, up to 4% of an organization's revenue or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. And so that's really gotten the attention of companies globally. Data controllers and data processors, just a quick word on that. This is the type of collaboration we always need to have, but GDPR starts to really spell this out. If you are a data controller, that generally means you're an enterprise or a corporation of some sort. And in our world, often data processors are the law firms or managed services providers. But these two entities really need to be on the same page as far as how they're going to handle sets of personal data as they find it. Whose job is it to catch it initially? Whose job is it to notify the data subjects? All of those things, and they need to really kind of have an agreement in place to work together on that. So one example that seems to resonate with almost anybody we're talking to, whether it's e-discovery or enterprise, is the example of resumes or CVs. Just to imagine how easily you can end up with PII and GDPR type categories of personal data within your organization. As you're receiving resumes through HR or through your hiring managers, you often, send those out to individuals on your team who might be helping you interview the candidates who are coming in. So pretty soon, you've got hundreds of resumes coming in. You're storing them in maybe central locations, but you're passing out certain resumes and CVs. And pretty soon you've got, your team members have stored them on SharePoint. They're in Exchange, they're in Slack, and of course they're printed out as well. We can't help with that so much, but they're stored all throughout. So if you let your mind wander, these are all unstructured data repositories. How do you possibly get your arms around all of those unstructured repositories and then proceed to identify all the PII within those repositories? So that's one area we work with clients on, and is the enterprise side, sort of mining all of your unstructured content repositories and identifying the PII and GDPR categories sort of preemptively. So if we take a step down into the technology for a second, this will kind of help understand how natural language processing and especially the more linguistic end where we sit, the linguistic end of NLP, how this entity-based analytics helps not only build indexes, but helps identify GDPR categories. So because ayfie already understands the linguistic structure of each language, it ships with a library of grammars that understands each generative grammar really of each language. So it starts at the sentence and phrase level by identifying each part of speech, the nouns, the verbs, the prepositions, and then it normalizes other terminology, recognizing synonyms like appointment is the same as meeting, division is equivalent to department, and it also starts normalizing variations of names. So R. Keating, it also will normalize dates. So if 10/22, October 22nd is present in that email, it'll see tomorrow and it'll know that it can also calculate 10/23 and store that as a searchable date. From there, what it does is it also builds up and classifies each of the individual entities that it's finding. So it knows right away that Keating is a person based on where it falls in the sentence. It knows that London is a location and not somebody's last name based on where it falls in the sentence. And it knows that tomorrow designates a particular date. And what it does is it codifies all of that into a machine language, into a distilled conceptual understanding. And this is one of the things that makes ayfie so intuitive to end users, because you can still read this machine concept and understand it the same way you did the sentence. So it's even at its root level, you can ayfie becomes very intuitive to understand. So another way to take a look at this is we do machine learning, but we build up several stages using natural language processing, and that gets us to what we've started calling an elevated machine learning. So it's all based on language and grammatical structures. So we first mine each sentence and phrase for the linguistics. We do the entity extraction. We normalize all of those entities. And then finally, we take the ball further down the field using machine learning and extrapolate from the knowns to the unknowns and identify those. So because it's based on natural language structures, it doesn't treat language just as a series of disconnected symbols or a bag of words. And that can become very helpful later on when you're using features like classification, for example. One of the things this does in classification is it gives you a much more white box instead of black box see-through interpretation of your results. So as documents are tagged as potentially part of a category, like potentially responsive or for a particular enterprise category, you can always trace back to those specific phrases and entities and a statistical figure as to why the classifier thought that document belongs. So it's traceable through the index back to specific pieces. So we'll do one other quick quiz here, an audience poll. How many entries does ayfie's NLP dictionary contain? And we'll just give it a couple seconds here for people to answer.
Give it your best guess.
Okay, we'll take a look at the results here. All right, I'll display this here. Yeah, most people are definitely on the right track here with this one. The answer is about 20 million. So, and 64% of the respondents got that one correct. So on the next slide, we'll help explain how this works in more detail. So to explain then how the indexes or the feature engineering works in ayfie, it helps to sort of look at it in 3 parts or 3 phases. So ayfie uses dictionaries, semantic dictionaries that specify all the different forms, the simple and complex words in that language. It includes specialized dictionaries of entities like the people, locations, organizations we looked at. And it also includes technical vocabularies that get identified at this phase from that language. So as an example, the basic English dictionary for ayfie contains about 20 million entries. Local grammars is the next phase. And these are specifications of how, in each language, there are billions of complex expressions like noun phrases, verb phrases, and how those get constructed out of simpler expressions. So contrary to other techniques like machine learning or statistical approaches, local grammars can be easily modified or extended. So you can modify these to capture certain new aspects or dialects of a language. Now finally, extraction algorithms. This is the final phase that really extrapolates the former 2 phases even further. The machine learning algorithms are based on a finite state technology that really helps achieve a very high efficiency processing. So even though there's a lot going on under the hood, all this happens extremely fast. As an example, the extraction algorithms can parse all of the 5.7 million Wikipedia articles in English in just a few minutes. So we'll take a quick look at a couple different dashboards. This is something we use internally or for enterprises. Of course, it's best to identify and protect personal data, PII, earlier in the information life cycle. The earlier you know about it, the better you are able to avoid data breaches of PII to begin with. And if you have to collect the data for specific reasons, for e-discovery or other reasons, you can avoid over collecting it if you've pre-tagged your PII and PHI. And then, finally, when collection is necessary, if you do collect this data, which often happens in life sciences or finance type use cases, you at least know where that PII is, or that personal credit information, so that it's much more automated downstream when you're doing things like review and production. Now, this is a quick look at relativity dashboards that we provide inside of Inspector for Relativity. So we automatically identify all the categories of PI that are found in a particular data set, and we chart those out, over time and by type. So you can easily filter these. You can batch these out for review. If you're doing a data breach type review, this can be your first pass review, just looking straight at the PII. We also capture other types of entities. We capture people and locations and organizations. And we're doing some other things. You can turn these things on or off in the tool, but if you need clustering, conceptual clustering, that can be turned on, and we can also do email threading and near dupe identification. So we're trying to really create an easy button for analytics and for PII identification within one of the industry's biggest tools. Now this is a glimpse of the Inspector dashboard as it sits within Relativity. And of course, this isn't a full demo, but if anybody is interested, we can schedule those. So this is where ayfie sits within Relativity. And here what we're really trying to do is provide predictive search. We do entity facet navigation, including PII and GDPR. And what we're trying to do is make this as easy of a navigation and intuitive and transparent for discovery purposes. Attorneys, we've found, are always looking to establish that fact pattern, the who did what when. And in cases of GDPR and PII, that definitely revolves around which data custodians or data subjects have their PII breach. So they're looking for people and PII categories. So with that, we've reached at least the end of the presentation phase. Thank you so much for your participation. GDPR is sometimes a dreaded topic for some of the people we talk to, but we find it to be a whole lot of nerdy fun around here for us. So we hope this helps your teams. And I think we have a couple minutes left for Q&A. And if we do, let me see if we've got some questions from Heather.
Yeah, so here's a couple questions that just popped up. Let me see here. So here's a good one. So how does ayfie define what is a person, location? How do we define that?
Okay, yeah. Good question. And that all stems back to like how ayfie identifies, or how it starts out with a linguistic approach to the natural language processing. It looks at the grammatical structures of each language and knows that ahead of time, really. So from the very first sentence, it's able to deconstruct into the constituent parts of speech. And we sometimes use the example of Kennedy. So from the very first sentence, if it sees Kennedy in a sentence, it's going to be able to tell you whether that's a person or an airport or a performing arts center, for example. So it's ready to parse the sentence and classify entities into the categories.
Here's another one, and this actually goes back to a few slides ago. How flexible is the dashboard that you just showed, and can you customize it with your own widgets?
Yeah, good question. Definitely, especially the relativity dashboard. Folks in the audience might be familiar with that one. That's as simple as you can create pivots off of any field of metadata. It's highly customizable. We ship with a certain set of dashboards, but those can easily be changed. And we've just tried to find what would be an ideal set of pivots as they get the data back into the tool. And then in our tools like ayfie's Inspector and Supervisor, we have a number of visualizations that help people drill down within the clusters or look at the relationships between different data subjects and how much they're emailing with one another. So there's a lot of flexibility in those as well.
Cool. Oh, here's a good one. This is actually one of my favorites. How does ayfie define AI?
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot that can be said about that. So I'll try to stick with the shorter answer instead of the dissertation. But first off, we're not talking about artificial general intelligence or super intelligence. We're not talking about Skynet or the Terminator here. So, but ayfie's technology, the natural language processing and machine learning, are very much AI technologies. Google's automatic identification of pictures. We're doing a lot of the same things. There's a whole ensemble of technologies from natural language processing and machine learning that go into identifying the individual entities, parsing the sentence, and then following that all the way through to machine learning workflows like classification or predictive coding. So further on down the stream, I guess the biggest thing I try to tell people when they're asking about AI is, what we're doing should be better described as more of an augmented intelligence than an artificial intelligence. There's something much more tangible about what we're doing, and it really comes down to kind of a return on investment, really. How much are you going to be saving time and cost-wise by implementing this augmented intelligence in your workflow versus doing it all manually? And how much risk will you reduce, and how much time will you save? So there's usually something very tangible that we can turn this into, and so augmented intelligence usually seems to be a better fit for the term anyway.
That's a great explanation, Paul. Thank you. And here's another question from Evan. Does ayfie use regular expressions to detect PII?
It does to some extent. It goes quite a few steps further, which is nice. And the main takeaway is you don't have to monitor and build and QA all of those regular expressions. So we do use some regular expressions to identify the known patterns for certain numbers, credit card numbers, social security numbers, mostly because it's just the most efficient way to grab those. But there's a whole lot of other contextual clues that we're using from natural language processing to take it further down the field and identify larger sets of phrases and all the other parts of GDPR. For example, I mean, GDPR covers all these other things like religious preference and things like that. So we have to use something other than pattern matching. We're using our linguistics to do that parts of it.
So in your opinion, Paul, what makes ayfie's solution so unique in the marketplace?
Well, it all comes down to like where it gets started, you know, the index that it's building, the feature engineering that it's doing. I've used other tools, and there's a variety of ways. You're always building some sort of an index, like a TF-IDF index or a LSI index, or in our case, a natural language processing entity-based index. If you have all the rules for how individual entities are related and co-related, you get a lot greater precision and transparency downstream when you're doing things like clustering, for example. Clustering titles, we've gotten a lot of comments from customers about how the clustering titles make more intuitive sense because we're using normalized entities from their data set to populate those titles. And then classification, we've shown greater precision on certain data sets by using our feature engineering. And it all shows up later with the same classifiers, but we get that transparent, that white box classification result, so we can always trace back to why a document fell into a category.
Well, I think we've gotten, at least 10 of you have asked, is there a demo available or a sandbox that they can play in? Paul?
Yeah, that's definitely something. I think the best would be for us to do a demo first for you guys. So if people call back or contact Heather, or we'll get a demo for you guys, figure out what it is specifically you're interested in. We have sort of enterprise solutions for GDPR, and we have, you know, downstream ECA and e-discovery type solutions. It's and so we could figure that out first, and then figure out whether it makes more sense to get you guys in a sandbox, you know, on our side or your side, or how that would best fit your team.
Yeah, so everyone, my contact information, Heather Murphy, heather.murphy@ayfie.com. Feel free to email me, contact me if you'd like to set up a demo. As I said earlier in the call, we will be sending out an email so you can have a copy of the recording as well as the slides of this webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up. Paul, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day for doing this webinar for us. And again, if anybody has any questions or requires any additional information, please feel free to contact me at your convenience. And I thank you guys all for showing up. This has been great.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great Thursday, everyone.